The flash and blue and red lights, reflecting off my new granite countertops, weren't exactly the housewarming gift I had envisioned. I stood in my own kitchen, a half-unpacked box of heirloom china at my feet, while three officers pointed tasers at my husband's chest, their shouts muffled by the roar of blood in my ears. Behind them, through the large bay window, I could see Mrs. Gable pointing a trembling finger at our front door, her voice shrill as she told the 911 dispatcher that dangerous vagrants had broken into the manor. She didn't realize that the man she was calling a criminal had spent 20 years earning the gold shield currently tucked in his back pocket, or that her crusade to protect the neighborhood was about to dismantle her entire life and expose the rot hidden behind the manicured hedges of Oakwood Estates. To understand how we ended up with our faces pressed against the hardwood floor of our dream home, you have to understand where we came from. For 15 years, Marcus and I lived in a two-bedroom apartment that smelled perpetually of old radiator steam and the neighbors' fried onions. We saved every cent, bypassed every vacation, and worked double shifts, him at the precinct, me at the design firm. Marcus was the kind of man who wore his integrity like a second skin. He was a detective who saw the worst of humanity and still came home to read bedtime stories to our daughter Maya, with a voice full of tenderness. When the call came that he had been appointed the new chief of police for the entire district, we cried. It wasn't just a promotion, it was the key to a different life. We chose Oakwood Estates because it looked like a postcard. The streets were lined with ancient oaks that arched over the road like a cathedral ceiling, and the houses were sprawling Victorians with wraparound porches and stained glass transoms. Our house, the old Miller place, was the crown jewel. It had been vacant for 2 years, and we poured our life savings into the down payment. I remember the day we got the keys. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and jasmine. Marcus carried me over the threshold, his laugh echoing in the empty hallway. We felt like we had finally arrived at a place where we belonged. The first hint that we were uninvited guests in our own home came on moving day. We were unloading the truck ourselves. Marcus wanted to save the extra money for Maya's new bedroom furniture. I was carrying a stack of blankets when I noticed a woman standing at the edge of our driveway. She was impeccably dressed in a cream-colored linen suit, her hair a stiff, frozen wave of silver. This was Evelyn Gable, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood association. She wasn't holding a pie or a welcome card. Instead, she held a clipboard, her eyes tracking Marcus's every move as he hauled a heavy dresser toward the porch. I walked over, forcing a smile despite the sweat stinging my eyes. I introduced myself, extending a hand that she pointedly ignored. She didn't look at my face. She looked at my skin, then passed me toward Marcus, her lips thinning into a hard, pale line. She asked if we were the service crew and if the owners would be arriving shortly. When I told her that we were the owners, the silence that followed was heavy and cold. She didn't congratulate us. She simply noted that there were strict ordinances regarding the color of window treatments and the height of the lawn, then turned on her heel and marched back to her own pristine white house across the street. Marcus told me to let it go. He was used to the look, that split second of calculation people did when they saw a man of his stature and color in a space they deemed exclusive. "We'll win them over, Elle," he told me that night as we sat on the floor of our new living room, eating Thai food out of plastic containers. "Once they see we're just a family like any other, the walls will come down." He was so optimistic, so proud of the badge he had worked so hard for. He wanted to believe that the world he protected would finally protect him back. But the walls didn't come down. They grew taller. Over the next week, the subtle signs of our unwelcome status became a constant background noise. A car would slow down to a crawl every time Maya played in the front yard, the driver staring until I stepped out onto the porch. The local grocery store clerk would ask to see my ID for a credit card purchase that no one else was questioned for. And then there were the phone calls. Mrs. Gable began calling the neighborhood association daily. She complained about the noise of our moving boxes being broken down. She complained that our car, a well-maintained but older SUV, was an eyesore that lowered property values. Every evening, Marcos would come home, hang his uniform in the hallway closet, and listen to me recount the day's microaggressions. He would rub his temples, the exhaustion of his new job as chief weighing on his shoulders, and remind me that we had the right to be here. He was busy restructuring the department, rooting out corruption, and trying to implement new community programs. He didn't have the energy for a neighborhood feud, so he played the part of the perfect neighbor. He waved, he kept our lawn immaculate, and he even offered to help the elderly man next door with his trash cans. The tension reached a boiling point on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the garden planting hydrangeas when I heard Mrs. Gable's voice from the sidewalk. She was talking to another neighbor, a younger woman who looked deeply uncomfortable. Mrs. Gable wasn't whispering, she was talking about security and how certain elements brought unrest to stable neighborhoods. She looked directly at me and said that it was only a matter of time before the police would have to be called to clear out the squatters. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I realized then that she didn't just dislike us, she felt threatened by our very existence in her view of the world. She viewed our success as a personal insult, a breach in the fortress she had spent her life maintaining. That night, Marcus told me he had a big announcement to make at the upcoming city council meeting. He was going to officially introduce himself as the new chief of police to the public. He was nervous and excited, practicing his speech in front of the mirror. "This is it, El," he said, adjusting his tie. "Once the community see who I am and what I stand for, all this nonsense with the neighbors will evaporate. They'll realize I'm the one keeping them safe." We had no idea that Mrs. Gable had already decided we were the danger she needed to be saved from. We didn't know she had been taking photos of our house, documenting every time a suspicious person, usually just Marcus's colleagues or our relatives, visited us. She was building a case in her mind, a fantasy where we were a criminal cell that had somehow bypassed the checks and balances of her elite world. The quiet life we had worked 15 years for was about to collide with her delusions in a way that would leave our front door kicked in and our sense of safety shattered. And as I looked at my husband, the man who believed in the law above all else, I had no idea that the law was about to be used as a weapon against us by the woman who lived just 50 feet away. The following Monday, the atmospheric pressure in Oakwood Estates shifted from chilly to suffocating. It started with the Watchful Eye newsletter, a printed flyer tucked into every mailbox on the street except ours. I only found out about it when our neighbor to the left, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Henderson, handed me his copy with a look of profound apology. Under the heading, "Maintaining Our Standards," there was a thinly veiled paragraph about the importance of verifying the legitimacy of new residents to prevent occupational shifts in neighborhood character. It didn't name us, but the message was as loud as a scream. My hands shook as I folded the paper. I felt like a specimen under a microscope, being judged by people who hadn't even bothered to learn our last names. When I showed it to Marcus that evening, he was exhausted. He had spent 10 hours in back-to-back meetings with city council members who were skeptical of his plan to increase transparency in the force. He barely glanced at the flyer before tossing it on the kitchen island. "It's just noise, Elena," he sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "They're old-fashioned. They'll get used to us. I can't fight a war on two fronts right now. I have detectives who haven't accepted a black chief yet. I can't be worried about a neighborhood newsletter." His dismissal stung. It was the first time in our marriage I felt like he was leaving me to hold the line alone. He was so focused on the mountain he was climbing that he didn't see the ground crumbling beneath our feet. The warning signs began to manifest in more sinister ways. I'd be walking Maya to the park, and I'd see Mrs. Gable standing on her porch with a pair of binoculars, not even trying to hide her surveillance. Once, I found her standing at the edge of our property, poking a stick into our flower beds as if she were looking for buried contraband. When I asked her what she was doing, she simply said, "Just checking for invasive species. We have very strict rules about what can be planted here." Her voice was like dry parchment, devoid of any human warmth. Then came the incident at the local cafe. I was waiting in line when I heard a group of women, all Oakwood residents, whispering behind me. I caught the words Section 8 and how did they afford it, and I heard his street police. I turned around, my heart hammering against my ribs, but they just stared through me as if I were a ghost. I left without my coffee, my face burning with a shame I shouldn't have felt. I began to second-guess everything. Was the car parked too far from the curb? Was my music too loud? I was living in a state of constant, low-level panic, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The point of no return arrived on a humid Thursday afternoon. Marcus was off duty but had been called into a late-night strategy session, so he was spending the day catching up on some heavy lifting around the house. He was wearing an old, oversized grey hoodie and sweatpants, his manual labor outfit. He was in the garage, moving crates of his old police files and some heavy gym equipment we hadn't unpacked yet. I was in the mudroom, sorting through a stack of mail that had been mistakenly delivered to the communal outgoing box at the end of the block. As I shuffled through the envelopes, a thick manila folder caught my eye. It had no address, just a handwritten note on the front. For the board, urgent. Thinking it was a neighborhood association document that had been dropped, I opened it. The air left my lungs in a single painful gasp. Inside was a dossier. There were dozens of photos of our house, but they weren't just snapshots. They were taken at night, with high zoom lenses. There were photos of Marcus coming home at 2 a.m. after a shift, labeled, "Subject returning at suspicious hours." There were photos of my brother, a lawyer who drives a flashy sports car, labeled, "Frequent visits from high-end vehicle, potential distribution link." But the worst was a printout of a private community forum thread, started by Mrs. Gable. The words on the screen made my stomach turn. "They don't fit the profile," she had written. "I've seen the man carrying heavy bags into the garage under the cover of darkness. He looks aggressive. He doesn't have the demeanor of a homeowner. I suspect they are squatters using a sophisticated front, or worse, using the property for illicit activities. We need to take our street back before the property values plummet." My legs gave out and I sank onto the bench in the mudroom. My pulse was a deafening roar in my ears. It wasn't just gossip. It was a coordinated attempt to criminalize us. My eyes blurred as I read the final entry from that morning. "I've seen enough. He's in the garage now, moving more merchandise. I'm calling it in. Let the professionals handle the trash." A cold, paralyzing dread washed over me. I looked out the window. Marcus was standing in the driveway, his back to the street, hauling a large, taped-up box toward the garage. He had his earbuds in, probably listening to a podcast, completely oblivious to the world. Then I heard it. The faint, distant wail of sirens. They weren't the standard sirens of a single patrol car. It was the synchronized, aggressive shriek of a high-priority response. My heart didn't just beat, it thrashed against my chest. I tried to scream Marcus's name, but my throat was tight, constricted by a sudden, violent nausea. I watched through the glass as 4 police cruisers rounded the corner of our quiet, oak-lined street, their tires screeching as they swerved toward our driveway. "Marcus!" I finally found my voice, but it was too late. The cars screeched to a halt, boxing in our SUV. Doors flew open. Officers jumped out, their weapons drawn, muzzles leveled directly at my husband's head. "Hands in the air! Drop the box! Get on the ground! Now! Now! Now!" I saw Marcus freeze. For a second, his brain, the brain of a 20-year veteran, struggled to process why his own brothers in blue were screaming at him as if he were a cornered animal. He dropped the box, and the sound of it hitting the pavement was like a gunshot. He began to raise his hands, his face a mask of shock and confusion, just as Mrs. Gable stepped out onto her porch across the street, a satisfied, icy smile playing on her lips as she watched the cleanup begin. The world slowed down.
I saw the finger of a young, nervous-looking officer tighten on the trigger of his service weapon. I realized in that heartbeat that my husband, the chief of police, was one startled flinch away from being killed in his own driveway, all because a neighbor decided his skin color was a crime. I burst through the front door, the screen slamming against the siding with a crack that sounded like a gunshot.
My lungs were screaming, my vision tunneling until all I could see was the matte black of the officer's pistols pointed at my husband's heart. Marcus was on his knees now, his hands laced behind his head. The man who had spent 2 decades commanding respect, who had been sworn in just days ago to lead these very men, was being pushed into the gravel of our own driveway. "Stop! Stop! He's the chief! He's the chief of police!" I screamed, my voice breaking into a jagged, raw sound. The officers didn't lower their weapons. One of them, a young sergeant named Miller, a man I recognized from the promotion ceremony, a man Marcus had personally praised for his service record, stepped forward. He didn't look at Marcus's face. He looked at the suspicious hoodie, the aggressive stature, the threat Mrs. Gable had fabricated. "Ma'am, get back inside. We have a report of a violent home invasion and a suspect moving stolen goods," Miller barked, his voice tight with an adrenaline that looked a lot like fear. "Miller, look at him!" I shrieked, fumbling with the wallet I had snatched from the mudroom. I threw it onto the pavement between them. "Look at the badge! Look at the ID!" Marcus remained silent. That was the most terrifying part. He wasn't yelling, wasn't resisting. He was frozen in a state of profound, soul-crushing shock. He stared at Miller, his eyes wide and glassy, reflecting the betrayal of a life's work. He had built his entire identity on the idea that the badge was a shield, a mark of brotherhood. Now that brotherhood was staring at him through the sights of a Glock. It was a silence so heavy it felt like it was crushing the air out of the street. Suddenly, a voice cut through the chaos like a serrated blade. "Officers, please, be careful. He's been moving those crates all morning. I told you, they're squatters. They've probably got weapons in that garage." Mrs. Gable was leaning over her picket fence, her face flushed with a dark, triumphant glow. She looked like she was watching the finale of her favorite show. She wasn't just a concerned citizen anymore, she was the director of this nightmare. Miller glanced at the wallet on the ground, then back at Marcus. For a second, the world stood still. He reached down, flipped open the leather case, and the gold shield of the police chief caught the afternoon sun, blindingly bright. The silence that followed was visceral. I watched the blood drain from Miller's face. He looked at the ID, then up at Marcus's face, finally seeing the man beneath the assumptions. "Chief?" Miller whispered, his voice cracking. "Chief Thorne?" The guns didn't just lower. They dropped as if they had suddenly turned white-hot. The officers scrambled backward, their faces a frantic mosaic of horror and realization. But the damage wasn't just done. It was total. Marcus slowly stood up, brushing the gravel from his knees. He didn't look at the officers. He didn't look at me. He looked across the street at Mrs. Gable. She hadn't retreated. Even as the officers began to stammer apologies, she stood her ground. "I don't care what kind of ID he has," she shouted, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch. "He doesn't belong here. This is a private community. I've already contacted the board, and we've filed a fast-track injunction for illegal occupancy. You can't just buy your way into a neighborhood like this with blood money from the city." That was the first twist. She hadn't just called 911. She had used her position on the neighborhood board to file a fraudulent claim that our house purchase was under investigation for fraud, effectively trying to freeze our right to live there until a legal battle could drain us dry. But there was a second, deeper betrayal. As Miller tried to explain why they had responded with such lethal force, he stammered out the truth. "Chief, we got an anonymous tip on the internal line this morning, saying the new appointee was under federal investigation for racketeering. The 911 call from Mrs. Gable, it just confirmed what we were told to expect. We were told to neutralize a high-risk situation at this address." My heart stopped. Someone inside the department, someone who hated Marcus's new policies,
had coordinated with Mrs. Gable. They had fed her the terminology, told her what to say to trigger a high-risk response, and then sat back to wait for the tragedy to happen. They hadn't just wanted him gone. They had wanted him dead or disgraced. I looked at Marcus. He was still standing there, his shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on the empty space where his pride used to be. The officers were circling him, babbling about protocol and mistakes, but he was 1,000 miles away. Mrs. Gable took the silence as a victory.
She walked down her driveway, stopping at the edge of the asphalt. "Go ahead, arrest me for a mistake if you want," she sneered, looking at Miller. "But I have friends in the mayor's office, and I have the bylaws on my side. This chief won't last a month in this town once the papers hear about the disruption he caused on his first week." She leaned in closer to me, her voice a venomous whisper that only I could hear. "You think you're one of us because you have a fancy title? You're just a guest who stayed too long, and I always get my way." She turned to walk away, a literal skip in her step. She thought she had won. She thought the system she had weaponized would protect her forever. She didn't see the way Marcus's hands finally clenched into fists. She didn't see the moment the light in his eyes changed from shock to a cold, predatory focus. The old Marcus, the one who believed in winning people over with kindness, had just been murdered in his own driveway. And the man who rose in his place was no longer interested in being a good neighbor. He was the chief of police, and he had just realized that his neighborhood was a crime scene. "Miller," Marcus said, his voice finally cutting through the air. It wasn't loud, but it had the weight of a falling guillotine. The sergeant snapped to attention, sweating through his uniform. "Yes, Chief?" "Secure the perimeter," Marcus said, eyes locked on Mrs. Gable's retreating back. "And get a crime scene tech out here. I want the 911 recordings, the internal tip logs, and I want a full search warrant for the Gable residence for suspicion of filing false police reports and conspiracy to commit aggravated assault." Mrs. Gable stopped in her tracks, her body stiffening. She turned around, the smirk finally faltering. "You can't do that. You have no grounds." Marcus stepped toward her, his stride slow and deliberate. He didn't stop until he was inches from her face. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "You wanted to see how a professional handles trash. Well, pay close attention. Because I'm about to show you exactly how the law works when it isn't being used as your personal plaything." The heat of the afternoon seemed to evaporate in an instant, replaced by a crystalline, Arctic stillness. I looked at Marcus and saw a man I had never met before. The warmth, the optimism, the good neighbor who wanted everyone to like him. That man had been buried under the gravel of our driveway. In his place stood a high-ranking official with 20 years of experience in dismantling criminal enterprises. He didn't look angry, he looked surgical. "Elena," he said, his voice as flat as a dial tone, "give me the folder you found." I handed him the manila dossier. As he flipped through the surveillance photos Mrs. Gable had taken, his jaw didn't even twitch. He handed the folder to Sergeant Miller, who was still trembling. "This is evidence of stalking, harassment, and a coordinated effort to subvert a police investigation. Sergeant, I want a forensic team on that neighbor's Wi-Fi and a subpoena for her phone records. She mentioned friends in the department. I want to know exactly which friends provided her with the internal codes to the tip line." The transformation was terrifying and beautiful. We weren't the new family anymore. We were the prosecution. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind of calculated legal destruction. Marcus didn't go to the precinct to scream. He went to the district attorney's office. It turned out that the anonymous tip had been traced back to a Captain Vance, a man who had been passed over for the chief position and had a history of old guard bias. He had been feeding Mrs. Gable information, coaching her on how to phrase her complaints to ensure a tactical response. They had been playing a game of chess with our lives, but they hadn't realized Marcus was the one who wrote the rulebook. The retribution came on a Tuesday evening at the Oakwood Estates monthly board meeting. The community hall was packed. Mrs. Gable was at the front,
looking regal in a navy blazer, whispering to the other board members. She looked up and smirked as we walked in. She clearly expected us to beg for our place in the neighborhood. She had even prepared a motion to review the residency status of the Miller property. "Mrs. Gable," Marcus said, stepping up to the microphone before the meeting could officially begin. He wasn't in his hoodie today. He was in his full-dress uniform, the gold shield, the 4 stars on his collar, the weight of his authority filling the room until the air felt thin. "This isn't the time for public comments, Chief Thorne," Mrs. Gable said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness.
"We are discussing neighborhood standards." "I agree," Marcus said, his voice booming without him even needing to shout. "So let's discuss the standard for criminal conspiracy. Today at 4 p.m., a warrant was executed at the residence of Captain Thomas Vance. He has been placed on administrative leave pending charges of official misconduct and falsifying police records. And 30 minutes ago, a second warrant was served at 14 Oakwood Drive." The color left Mrs. Gable's face so fast it was as if a plug had been pulled. The room went dead silent. "We found the digital logs, Evelyn," Marcus continued, his eyes locked on hers. "We found the emails you sent to Vance asking for tactical advice on how to get us removed. We found the high-resolution photos of my 10-year-old daughter playing in our backyard, photos taken from your second-story window. That's not neighborhood watch. That's felony stalking of a minor." The murmurs in the room turned into a roar of hushed, horrified whispers. The neighbors who had looked the other way, who had whispered in the cafe, were now shrinking back from Mrs. Gable, as if she were radioactive. "You can't do this," she stammered, her hands shaking so violently she had to grip the edge of the podium. "I was protecting the community. I was making sure we were safe." "You weren't protecting the community," I said, standing up from my seat. I felt the click Marcus had felt. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. "You were weaponizing the police because you couldn't stand the fact that we earned the life you think you inherited. You tried to turn my husband's own officers into his executioners. You're not a pillar of this community, Evelyn. You're a liability." The legal hammer fell hard. Mrs. Gable was arrested that night for filing false police reports and felony stalking. The lawsuit we filed against the Neighborhood Association for civil rights violations was so ironclad that the board members were falling over themselves to settle, terrified of the public relations nightmare. Captain Vance was forced into a shameful retirement, facing a litany of charges that would ensure he'd never hold a weapon again. As for Mrs. Gable, the standards she loved so much eventually turned on her. The legal fees and the settlement drained her accounts, and within 6 months, a "for sale" sign appeared on her pristine lawn. No one helped her pack. 4 months have passed since that afternoon in the driveway. The oak trees are losing their leaves now, carpeting the street in gold and rust. I'm sitting on our wraparound porch, the smell of wood smoke and crisp autumn air filling my lungs. Maya is in the yard, laughing as she tries to rake the leaves into a mountain, and Marcus is beside me, finally relaxed, a cup of coffee in his hand. The neighborhood is different now. The Watchful Eye newsletter was disbanded. Mr. Henderson from next door often stops by to trade gardening tips, and the younger families on the block have started a weekly potluck. The silence of Oakwood Estates is no longer the heavy, judgmental silence of a fortress. It's the quiet, peaceful hum of a home. Marcus looked at me, the setting sun reflecting off the wedding band he's worn for 15 years, the same hand that had been pressed into the gravel not so long ago. He hasn't forgotten that day, and neither have I. It's the scar that reminds us of the price of our peace. "You know," he whispered, watching Maya jump into the pile of leaves, "I used to think the badge was what gave me authority. I was wrong." "What is it then?" I asked, leaning my head on his shoulder. He looked at the house, then at the street where Mrs. Gable's house stood empty and dark. "It's the truth," he said. "The badge is just a piece of metal, but the truth is a shield that never breaks, no matter who tries to swing at it." I looked out at our lawn, perfectly green and unbothered. We aren't guests here anymore. We are the foundation. And as the stars began to peek through the ancient oaks, I realized that some people spend their whole lives trying to build walls to keep the world out, never realizing that the strongest walls are the ones built on the ground you refuse to give up.